Today's reading is from Matthew 17, 1 through 9. Please feel free to read along by turning to page 18 in the New Testament portion of your pew Bibles. "6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah, talking with them. When Peter said to Jesus, 'Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah.' While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud a voice said, 'This is my Son, the Beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him.' When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, 'Get up and do not be afraid.' And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, 'Tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead.' May the Spirit of wisdom guide our understanding of this scripture.
Thanks be to God.
Will you pray with me? Loving God, it is our prayer just now that the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts would be acceptable and pleasing to you. For you remain our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. At first, we don't know. We just wonder. And then maybe we sort of suspect. We think we know something, but we tell ourselves, no, that can't be right. And then somehow we find out. And then we know. And once we know that we know, what we've learned changes everything that came before. This is certainly true when what we find out is bad. At first, our husband just found that early morning hours before the world woke up were the most peaceful parts of the day to go out for a run. He'd come in hot and sweaty for the shower and would be all ready to face the day. At first, we don't know. But then those runs kept getting longer and longer, and he'd get back to the house only a few minutes before the carpool was supposed to pick him up and take him to work. He'd barely have time to say anything between the time when he stepped into the house and the time when he went back to work again. Gotta go! At first we don't know, and then we might know a little something is amiss. But then, on that one morning, when he didn't come back at all from his run, and he missed his ride to work altogether, he didn't call, and for all you knew, he was laid out somewhere on the side of the road, the victim of a hit and run. And so you go out and you get in your car to go look for him, and as you leave, you notice that his car isn't where it normally is supposed to be. And then you're driving through the neighborhood trying to find him, but you find his car instead. And his car is parked outside your friend's house. And as you slow down just to make sure it's really his car, the front door opens, and it's him, and it's her, and then you know. You know, and once you know, everything that came beforehand is cast in a brand new, harsh, and embarrassing light. All those early morning runs that got longer and longer. Once we know, things become clear, don't they? The same is true for our health sometimes, right? That nagging cough is just that. It's just a cough that won't let go. That numbness in our fingers or the pain in our side, it begins to make us wonder, maybe, but now we're just borrowing trouble. Then comes the routine physical, and while our doctor has always been very attentive, we were still surprised to see her phone number on the caller ID the very next afternoon. Can you come in at the end of the day? Can you bring in your wife with you? And then on that last appointment of her schedule for the day, the door closes and you find out. And then you know. And all those things that came beforehand, they make a new kind of sense once we know. Of course, it happens when the news is good too, right? I don't know about all of you. I'll bet this is true for you. Maybe not, but our family is big on surprises. So while it may have escaped our notice that a certain someone had refrained from her usual glass of wine at Easter dinner, and while we may have wondered why, when it wasn't really a special occasion, we got an intentionally casual phone call, text message, invitation. Hey, you want to come down to the house for some burgers? Once we arrived and went out there by the niece's swing set, that's when he said it. Well, it looks like we're going to need one of these swing sets in our backyard too. Oh, you dog. When are you due? And then we knew. And all of a sudden everything else falls into place. Once we know, and things can look a whole lot different. I'm kind of thinking that this was true for the disciples as well. I think at first Jesus' disciples didn't really know what he was all about. This part of the Gospel of Matthew is set in and around the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee is up in the northern part of the Holy Land, Jesus' stomping ground, his home turf where people know him, the Sea of Galilee. It's shaped like a heart, and the whole one side of the heart, the east side of the heart, where the left ventricle would be, that part of the Sea of Galilee borders on western Syria. But if you go straight up from the Sea of Galilee and travel straight up the aorta, all the way to the top of Israel, where Israel and Syria meet again, near the modern-day Golan Heights, you get to where this story happened that Deb read for us. In Caesarea Philippi, a city that was established by Philip II, named in honor of Caesarea, not too long before Jesus would have visited there. An outpost, a place where the Romans were able to tax people traveling from the east and to the west and back again. Caesarea Philippi is about as far north of Jerusalem that Jesus ever traveled. Caesarea Philippi is where Jesus asked that famous question, who do people say that I am? Caesarea Philippi is where Jesus asked Peter specifically, who do you say that I am? And he answered, the Messiah. Caesarea Philippi is where Jesus began to just slowly break the news to the disciples about his upcoming and impending death. And the disciples were like, no, that can't happen. We're just hitting our stride. Caesarea Philippi is where Jesus said to Peter, get thee behind me, Satan, when Peter said, this can't happen to you. Caesarea Philippi is where Jesus told his disciples, if anyone wants to be my followers, they're going to have to take up their cross to follow me. All this stuff happened. All this meaty stuff happened in Caesarea Philippi. Jesus said all of these things in this place. He told them a lot of stuff about what was going to happen. But I don't know. I still don't know that the disciples really knew. Not then. The other thing that's true about Caesarea Philippi, and which actually may be why Matthew places this story in this place, is because this town lays at the foot of Mount Hermon, which is the highest point in Israel. It's up there around 9,300 feet. So when this story tells us that Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up to a high mountain, Mount Hermon would definitely more than qualify. And once they were all up there, that's when this strange, weird, almost dreamlike thing happened. Two men appeared who looked just like the disciples had always pictured Moses and Elijah to look like. Was it all a dream? Was it real? Are you seeing this too? Peter, who's a take charge kind of guy, decides he's going to build a house for each of these strangers. Then comes the bright cloud and the voice like the great and mighty eyes. This is my son, which for obvious reasons terrified those poor guys. They're still covering their heads when Jesus walks up and taps them on the shoulder. And what does he say? Don't be afraid. Get up. Do not be afraid. Then, on the way down the mountain, Jesus says, don't tell anyone about any of this until the Son of Man is raised from the dead? That's weird. All of this had to have made for a very strange day in the life of Peter and James and John. But I still kind of think that the three of them didn't really know. Didn't know what Jesus was talking about. And you can't really blame them, right? For not knowing, for not seeing. Jesus was just that guy. He was their buddy. You and I, we probably all have friends who are filled with big ideas, grandiose expectations, visions of grandeur. I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, this is going to happen. Maybe Peter, James, and John were thinking that way about Jesus. Or maybe they were beginning to wonder about him. Maybe they were beginning to think about Elijah and Moses and think maybe Jesus was in the same ballpark. Or maybe they were just thinking he was someone, that guy who just wandered from the town next door. We can excuse the disciples for not really knowing because it's hard to know at first. There's something that resists knowing. But then, after this event happened up on Mount Hermon, all those other things that Jesus talked about began to unfold. The journey down to Jerusalem, the crowds, the trial, the verdict, the death he spoke of. And after Jesus was put to death, just like he said was going to happen, he was somehow still with them in the garden, by the Sea of Galilee, out there on the road to Emmaus, in that upper room. He was somehow still alive. And that, I think, is when the disciples looked back and knew. Looked back onto that morning mountaintop, and everything fell into place, because finally they knew. Hey, Peter, you remember that time on that mountain when Jesus said all that stuff? Knowing makes all the difference in the way we live out our stories. Knowing transfigures ordinary moments and sends them up to the mountain. This story of the transfiguration of Jesus was written after the resurrection of Jesus made its details clear. And it made knowing all the difference. Last week, our guest speaker, Dan, told us about how so many people in our congregations are suffering through some kind of depression or mental illness. 1 in 6, he said. And then he said that they suffer in silence, even though they're part of those of us who are here. We can't unknow that kind of information. We've been suspecting that the world is warming for many years. Smoggy cities, melting ice caps. The evidence has been mounting, but you know what? Now we kind of know. We know that after 12 years or maybe 15 or 20 years, the world might reach a point of no return. We know that, and it changes everything. Knowing transfigures us. About a month ago, a bus full of us drove onto an Israeli settlement out of the poverty that is the West Bank of Palestine. Onto the finely manicured lawns, the playgrounds, the sidewalks, the driveways, the recreation centers, one of a dozen Israeli settlements that sits on top of a hill in an otherwise impoverished area. You can't unknow that kind of injustice. So maybe the question for us today is, what is it that we have finally just discovered and know to be true? And how will that change us? Granted, it took the disciples a while to figure Jesus out. But once they did, once they knew, everything changed. Everything.
As they fished in the lake of Gennesaret, they had